Welcome back, my friends. This is the 9th message in a series of 12 messages in the book of Deuteronomy. In the early messages of the series, I introduced you to the setting of this book in history and geography. In the following messages of the series, we considered key themes in the book, including God's love for Israel, the danger of forgetfulness, and God's rules for Israel's future kings. In messages 6 through 8, we turned our attention to Israel's special relationship to the Promised Land. We considered the land covenant of Deuteronomy chapters 28 through 30, in which God laid out for Israel the principle of blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. We saw that because of this dynamic, every coming generation in Israel would have their own opportunity to seek God's blessings through obedience and the exclusive worship of Him and Him alone. Up to this point in our study of the land covenant, we have placed our attention on chapters 28 and 29, where the covenant provisions are stated in the form of, "If you, Israel, do this, then I, God, will do this." So far, the provisions of the covenant have been conditional in nature. But as we move into chapter 30, we see a new aspect of the land covenant. This new aspect is not conditional, but rather predictive. In other words, this part of the covenant predicts not what might happen, but rather what will happen. Whereas the earlier part of the covenant dealt with what was possible, this part of the covenant deals with what is inevitable. I will be devoting this message and the next two that follow to exploring the content and the implications of this predictive part of the land covenant. Listen as I read the first 3 verses of chapter 30. These 3 verses form a single sentence. In this sentence, we find the heart of the predictive portion of the land covenant. Our focus today will be on the first part of this prediction, which appears in verse 1. Listen now to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 3. "Now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey His voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you." Listen now again as I read to you just the first half of verse 1. Pay attention and see whether you can identify the main prediction found here. "Now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you." Did you catch the prediction? In the earlier part of the land covenant, God had said, "If you disobey me and persist in disobeying me, I will pour out the worst of all the curses on you. I will bring invaders into the promised land. They will conquer your land and deport you to foreign lands." That was only a conditional warning, but here in verse 1 of chapter 30, God makes a prediction. He says, in effect, it is not a question of whether a future generation of Israel will be expelled from the land. It is only a question of when. A future generation of Israel will surely be expelled from the land. It is only a question of time. In the next 2 messages, we will consider the rest of the prophecy in which God also predicts a future return of the people of Israel to the land. But today I want to zero in on this initial prediction, the certainty that some future generation after the days of Moses will build a debt of guilt so large before God that He will have no choice but to impose the worst and ultimate penalties of the land covenant. We who live in the post-cross era know that God imposed that penalty first on the northern kingdom Israel in 722 BC when the Assyrians conquered and deported the northern tribes, and then in 586 BC when the Babylonians conquered and deported the southern kingdom Judah. It is easy for us to look back on those events from our distant perspective and simply accept them as history. But today I want you to try to place yourself in the shoes of an Israelite who was hearing these words of Moses for the first time. You don't know the details of Israel's future history. It's only the year 1406 BC. You know nothing of the Assyrians or the Babylonians. You only know that God is about to lead you and your people across the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and that He is placing before you both an opportunity and a warning. Moses is concerned that the Israelites will not take God's warnings seriously. Listen to verses 11 to 18 of chapter 30, in which Moses seeks to motivate them to take God's warnings to heart. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 to 18. For this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, and to keep His commandments, His statutes, and His judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. But if your heart turns away so that you do not hear, and are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not prolong your days in the land which you cross over the Jordan to go in and possess. We might paraphrase Moses' warning as follows. God's covenant arrangement with you is no secret. God has told you in the simplest of terms how He will interact with your nation in years to come. He will bless you if you obey and curse you if you disobey. Now it is up to you. If we were to trace the history of Old Testament Israel, we would see that the fall of the nation into disobedience was not a sudden thing. It took place over many centuries, and there were ups and downs. Many were the times when Israel fell into idolatry and experienced the covenant penalties, but then she repented and was restored to God's blessing. Nonetheless, there was a general downward trend in the quality of Israel's spiritual walk before God. In that trend, we can discern a number of stages. First, there was active and enthusiastic obedience. Then a bit of laziness crept in. Then came compromise. The days of King Solomon, when he allowed his pagan wives to worship their false gods, is an example. Times when the Israelites offered their sacrifices to the true God, but did so on the high places, give us another example of compromise. Next came indifference, as the people of Israel began to conclude that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob wasn't really active in the world anymore. Finally came outright rejection, when the people of Israel abandoned the one true God, replacing Him with false gods like Baal and Ashtoreth and Molech. The results of this downward spiral were, of course, disastrous. Those final generations of the northern kingdom Israel and the southern kingdom Judah experienced horrors that are hard for us to imagine. They huddled inside crowded walled cities as invaders put them under siege. They experienced starvation and resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. When the invaders finally broke through the walls, the last thing that many Israelite fathers saw was their pregnant wives having their wombs ripped open and their children taken away as captives. The few who survived lost everything. They found themselves captive in unknown lands where people spoke strange languages. They were forced to work as slaves. They died longing to return to the Promised Land, the land where once their nation had flourished under God's generous hand. How did a nation that started so well end up so poorly? Let me suggest that the ultimate cause of Israel's failure was the failure of each generation to train their children in the right way to go. Listen to God's command to parents in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. This passage is known among the Jews as the Great Shema. Shema is the command, listen. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. There's much deep theology in this short passage, but I want to focus on the exhortation, which can be summarized as a single command. Teach your children the truth about God. This was the duty of every generation of Israelites, to teach their children the truth about God so that when they grew up and became the leaders of Israel, they would remain faithful to God and they would experience the blessings of God. This is where successive generations of Israel failed. They didn't teach their children to know, to love, to fear, and to serve the one true God. And so each generation drifted further and further away until they were so far from God that he had no choice but to be faithful to his promise to judge the nation according to the provisions of the land covenant. Perhaps you come from a Christian family in which you were taught to know and love and serve the one true God. If so, thank God and rejoice that your parents did their job well. Or perhaps you are like me and you were raised in a family that ridiculed the God of the Bible. Yet by God's grace you still heard and believed the gospel. If so, thank God and rejoice that God saved you. None of us can choose our parents, nor were we able to choose the ways in which they raised us. The only thing over which we as individuals have control is our choice regarding how we will train those whose lives are entrusted to us. Every generation in Israel had the opportunity to say, yes, we know from God's prediction in the land covenant that judgment must come one day in the future, but it doesn't have to be in our generation or in the generation of our children. It's our responsibility to train the next generation to follow God faithfully. You and I, as believers, have the same responsibility. How are we doing? Are you teaching your children to know, to love, to fear, and to serve the one true God and Him alone? Are you discipling others who may not be your children, but over whom you have influence or perhaps even spiritual authority? I urge you, as I urge myself, let us not miss our opportunity to influence the next generation for their good. If we teach them to follow Jesus Christ, then whether good times or hard times follow, we will know that they are safe in the arms of Jesus because we were faithful in our generation. May God enable us, by the guidance of His Word and the power of His Holy Spirit within us, to train up the next generation in the way that they should go.